Hi, my name's Martin J. Smith. I'm the author of a new book, Going to Trinidad, which is a very deeply Colorado story. And I want to talk about it, and I want to thank the Boulder Bookstore for inviting me to participate in this Q&A. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your readers. If you want to know more about me or the book, my website is www.martinjsmith.com. And before I start with the questions, I wanted to read a quick snippet from a review that ran last week in the High Country News by reviewer Claire Rudy Foster. She said, as a record of institutionalized perspectives on transgender people and the dominant beliefs concerning us at the time, Trinidad is indispensable. In a world that demeans, dehumanizes, and discriminates against trans people, it's the story of a doctor who offered them a sense of ownership over their bodies. Ultimately, it's a brutal telling, hard to read, though vital to hear. Going to Trinidad is the story of a window of 41 years between 1969 and 2010, when tiny, remote, former mining town of Trinidad, Colorado, was considered the center of the universe for transgender men and women who were seeking relief from gender dysphoria through surgery. It's the story of Stanley Biber, who was a surgeon who started doing those surgeries in 1969, began specializing in it. Word got around that he treated his patients with compassion and without judgment. And soon he was doing 3 to 4 surgeries a week. People traveled from all over the world to Trinidad. As I said, it's a very deeply Colorado story, and one that I think every Coloradan should know. So let me start with the first question, which Stephanie offered, which is, what inspired you to write this book? And for that, I have to go back to 1990, the early 1990s. I was having a family reunion with my large extended family. About 80 of us were gathered in the YMCA of the Rockies Family Reunion Lodge in Estes Park. And that was the year that my cousin, one of my cousins, decided to come out as trans to the family. And she did so in a fairly remarkable way. The first morning at breakfast, she came wearing a single post earring in one ear, which wasn't unusual, didn't cause any conversation. But the second morning, she came with an earring in each ear, a very simple earring in each ear. By the fourth morning at breakfast, she was wearing very feminine earrings, which caused a lot of interesting conversation at the reunion, and sparked a countless number of questions in my mind. I didn't understand what was going on there. I was fascinated by it, but I didn't understand it. Flash forward to 2016, when I moved to Colorado from Southern California after a long career in journalism in Southern California. And I started hearing stories about Trinidad, Colorado, and its interesting history as this transgender crossroads for those 41 years. And I thought, okay, maybe this is a way for me to take those questions out of that lockbox in my head and start to unpack them. All these questions I had about gender and how it develops and so forth, and transitioning. And I thought this is a good opportunity because it's not an abstract idea. This is not a story of me telling about queer theory. It's a real place with real people and real characters, and so I started researching. And the more I learned about what happened in Trinidad during those years, the more I wanted to tell the story. It had everything I wanted in a story, and I write novels as well. I've written 5 crime novels, and what you look for in a great story, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, is larger than life characters, high stakes to those characters, and an extremely make it as extremely timely as it can possibly be. And this was in 2017, at a time when transgender civil rights were under direct assault. And it felt very urgent for me to write a story that would be accessible to people like me who grew up in a gender binary world, but are mystified by the transgender experience and the transgender journey. This might be an accessible way for people like that to learn not only what happened in Trinidad, but also learn a lot about gender, just as I did while I was writing it. The second question is, how did you first learn about Stanley Biber and the gender confirmation surgery he pioneered? Again, it was when I moved to Colorado in 2016, and I kept hearing these stories, and just felt, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that although the story of Trinidad had received a lot of media coverage, both in Colorado and in national media, nobody had written a book about it. And part of the appeal was that it was a complete story arc. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. It started in 1969. It ended in 2010 when Dr. Biber's protege, Marcy Bowers, who was transgender herself, took the practice and moved it to California. And so it ended. So it had a complete story arc, and I thought that's perfect for a book. So let me get going on that. And so I did. I began the kind of research, and that leads me to the third question here. What kind of research did you do while writing this book? Well, there are four main characters in the book. There are the two surgeons who operated there in Trinidad. First, there was Stanley Biber. And keep in mind, this is when I talked about larger-than-life characters, this is a Jewish surgeon operating at a Catholic hospital run by the Sisters of Charity, doing gender confirmation surgeries. So it was like peeling layers of an onion. He was a fascinating character from beginning to end. And you throw on top of that a complicated family life. He had 5 wives, 9 children and stepchildren. He was a rancher. He got up every morning before he went to the hospital and, ran his cattle ranches. He was a former weightlifter, and all his life he was actually a bodybuilder. At 5'4", he essentially looked like a cannonball. He was, kind of a broad person. And there was just so much about him that I found interesting. Marcy Bowers, the other surgeon, is fascinating herself. I mean, she is transgender herself. She is an established, well-respected OBGYN in Seattle at the time she decided to move to Trinidad and take over that practice. And she's extremely articulate about trans issues. And I thought she would be a great interview as well. So I got to spend time with her at her new practice in California. There are 2 other main characters. I wanted to follow 2 of their patients, and they turned out to be 2 of Dr. Biber's patients, again, who could give me the full arc of their journey from before, during, and after. I focused on 2. One is Claudine Griggs, who had written a memoir herself about her experiences in Trinidad. So she had kept contemporaneous records that I thought I could use to sort of reconstruct what she went through there. She was also still alive and therefore willing to talk to me about her life before, during, and after the surgery. So I could get a full sense of that journey. The other character was a gentleman named Walt Heyer, who is very controversial these days because he is an advocate for what's called the sex change regret movement, trying to talk people out of it, or at least reconsidering the idea of surgery, and raising questions about transgenderism itself. He's a lightning rod for the LGBT community, and it was a controversial choice of mine to include him in the book. But I focus in the book not on who he is now, and I tried not to give him a platform for those opinions, but I wanted to focus his story in the book on his 40-year struggle with mental illness, which I think gives context to who he is now. That's why I chose those 2 characters to follow through. And then, of course, I had to do the gender research and understand what the latest scientific research tells us about gender. And I also needed to do quite a bit of historical research in the town of Trinidad, because it in and of itself is a fascinating story. Fourth question is, how did you come across these 2 patients that you focus on in the book? And I wanted to say a little bit more about Walt Heyer and Claudine Griggs. There were 6,000 medical pilgrims who passed through Trinidad during those 41 years. And you think, oh gosh, there must be endless stories here, because each of those stories is an individual journey. But there are other considerations. One is there are HIPAA regulations, privacy rules. Those are not, the patients who came to Trinidad for surgery, those are not public names. Those are hidden away in files that the doctors kept that I don't have access to because of HIPAA regulations. So very quickly it becomes a limited pool of possibilities. And there were other criteria, as I mentioned. There had to be a willingness to relive all these stages of their lives. Both Walt Heyer and Claudine Griggs were willing to talk about their lives before. And many transgender men and women are not, because that was often a very difficult period of their life, and revisiting it can stir a lot of painful memories. But they were willing to talk about that and willing to talk about the entire arc of that. And they needed to be still alive because I still needed to talk to them and spend time with them. And I needed those contemporaneous records. And both Walt Heyer and Claudine Griggs left behind journals that I could access and use as prompts to help me revisit that period of their lives. The fifth question is, what's one thing you wish everyone knew about gender dysphoria? And I just wrote a piece for The Hill that was published in which I talked about the lessons I learned on this journey of my own. And I think the one thing I wish everyone understood about gender dysphoria is the difference between gender and genitalia. We are assigned at birth, we are assigned our gender by a maternity nurse or a doctor taking a quick look between our legs and seeing what's there and deciding that's our gender. And it's a very, very crude measure of gender. Biology and physical, aspects of our bodies is one aspect of gender, and it's often interrelated with gender, but it doesn't always prescribe gender. Gender is a function of the brain and self-perception. It's much more complicated than simply the fleshy bits. And understanding that difference, people seem startled that transgender men and women simply declare themselves one day to be a certain gender. No, they've always been that gender. If you talk to many of them, as I have done, they've known since they were children what gender they were. It just didn't align with the physical body they were given. And when that is not corrected or addressed, that can cause extreme difficulty, both emotional and physical. And that's what I think Going to Trinidad, my book, gets at. The sixth question is, what's the simple thing everyone can do to support trans people and trans rights? And I think understanding their struggle. Once you understand the torment that many of them carry with them into transition, whether that be simply social cues, dressing in the gender that they are, or something a little more proactive, such as taking hormones, or something a little more radical, hormones and surgery. It depends, whatever is right for that individual. And we know at this point that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for gender dysphoria. But understanding that struggle, and by the time they arrive, for example, in Trinidad at the surgeon's office, understanding what they've been through to get to that point, and it makes it impossible to do or to even tolerate some of the caricaturing that's going on and demonizing that's going on of transgender men and women in our culture. The idea that these are men in dresses simply trying to get into a girl's locker room is an absurd notion. The more you understand, the more you know, and the more transgender men and women whose stories you've heard. And the second thing I would say that you can do to support trans men and women and trans rights is to listen to their stories. If they're willing to tell you, you'll be struck by how articulate they are about the journey that they're on, and it's a learning process, and it certainly was for me in writing this book. Finally, is there anything else you want us to know about the book? And I would just reemphasize that it is such a deeply Colorado and a deeply Western American story. There's a Colorado History put together a really terrific exhibit called Borderlands a while back that talked about how Innovation thrives in the borderlands, places that are far from New York and Los Angeles, in places like Trinidad, where these kind of innovations can happen organically, out of the media spotlight. Um, it's such a deeply Colorado story. I urge everyone in Colorado to become familiar with it. And again, the book is Going to Trinidad by Martin J. Smith. Um, and they've asked me to read a short passage from the book, which I'll be happy to do now. This is from chapter 3 in Going to Trinidad. Um, and I've introduced at that point in the book both Claudine Griggs and Walt Heyer, the two patient characters that I follow. And this is where I pull the camera back and talk a little bit more about Trinidad itself. Not all roads led to Trinidad between 1969 and 2010. But for 41 years in the worldwide transgender community, a startling number of them did. By the time both Walt Heyer returned to Stanley Biber's office in 1983 and Claudine Griggs showed up in 1991, the phrase going to Trinidad already was well understood shorthand among transgender men and women, easier than saying, "I've made the most difficult decision of my life," and certainly easier than trying to explain the pain, self-loathing, and emotional and psychological uncertainty that brought someone to the side entrance of the First National Bank building, up the creaking archaic elevator or the steep stairs, to Dr. Biber's fourth-floor office for a pre-surgery consultation. Going to Trinidad covered it, and for those who understood, a simple nod of the head was the only response required. Trinidad's role in transgender history has been well known in Colorado for decades. Pueblo native and Colorado historian Tim Nicholas recalls talk of Trinidad during his middle and high school days, the invocation of its name a convenient insult to a classmate's manhood. Bucky Carr of Boulder, Biber's nurse anesthetist at Mount St. Raphael Hospital for a decade, also remembers hearing Trinidad used as a handy taunt, a running joke for snarky Coloradans. High school boys would say, "If you're going to whine and cry like a girl, why not go to Trinidad and become one," he recalls. But outside of the state, even today, among the estimated 1.4 million transgender men and women in the U.S., the role Trinidad played in the gender identity universe remains to most an improbable surprise. It's not exactly clear why, and those who do know about it are likely part of the LGBTQ community. The Denver Post magazine told the Trinidad story in a July 1983 cover story titled "Starting Over." Writer John Tayman chronicled Biber in Trinidad in a December 1991 Gentleman's Quarterly story titled "Meet John Jane Doe." And Tayman accompanied one surgical pilgrim he called Dean Wakeman before, during, and after his operation. But by the mid-1990s, Biber's work was making headlines in other, distant and significant publications. So it's not that word wasn't getting out. The Los Angeles Times featured Biber in a 1995 story headlined "The Bodybuilder," noting in a secondary headline that Biber had already been correcting nature's miscues for 25 years. An operating room photo accompanying that story showed Biber's face masked in surgical garb as he peered into the artfully cloaked undercarriage of an anesthetized patient, and included comments from a Biber patient named Henrietta, a 22-year Army veteran who retired from the military as a sergeant first class. Out magazine's story that same year told a similar tale beneath the headline, "Biber People." It featured a different photo of Biber in surgical scrubs, but also one with the surgeon wearing his trademark Western shirt and cowboy hat and standing outside the bank building where his professional offices were housed. Biber was even name-checked and featured in a March 9th, 2005 episode of the animated TV series South Park called Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, in which the transgender schoolteacher character travels to see a Dr. Biber at the Trinidad Medical Center to undergo the surgery. Despite the occasional spotlight stories and pop culture acknowledgments, Trinidad, as sex change capital of the world, didn't seem to register much in the American consciousness during those years, and was easy to dismiss as a distant, somewhat sensational signal emanating from the middle of nowhere. Transgender people were the ultimate other, unfamiliar, a little scary, hard to fathom. But day in and day out, week after week, month after month, the Pilgrims came. In addition to other surgical duties, Biber and his eventual successor, Dr. Marcy Bowers, often were doing 3 or more gender confirmation surgeries a week. And what happened in Trinidad didn't stay in Trinidad. Their patients invariably returned home to lives, communities, and careers, many becoming emissaries for an idea that to some still seems foreign and freakish. The Trinidad Pilgrims began colonizing schools and offices, churches, bringing with them the uncomfortable fact that transgender men and women are people with joys and sorrows, ambitions and goals that aren't much different from anyone else's. When the other is your cousin or friend or co-worker, they're damned hard to demonize. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you taking a flyer and tuning in here. Again, the book is Going to Trinidad. I'm its author, Martin J. Smith. I'm a Colorado resident, and again, I thank the Boulder Bookstore for inviting me to participate in this Q&A, and I look forward to hoping that our paths cross sometime in the real world. Thanks very much.